Hi, welcome to the Bond Online, and today we're going to talk about how to create an enterprise application via the Graph API. Um, if you look at the documentation of Microsoft, let's start there. You can create an application via the Graph API, of course. The explanation as usual. First thing I'm going to look at is the application rights we need for our own Graph API we connect to. The API permissions are application read write owned by and application read write all. But since we also are going to do app role assignments, which is required also for the application roles and the admin consent, we need to add this API permission also. So first thing we're going to do is add to our MS Graph API connector these three permissions. So let's start with that. If you're new here to the channel and you've never seen other videos, I recommend to especially watch episode 1 and 3, in which I will explain how to set up the API enterprise application, which we use to for scripting to connect to the ADI, to the Azure AD, and then modify our enterprise applications, users, groups, etc. So how this set up, the Graph API connector is explained in episode 1 and episode 3. So we need to add 3 permissions. So we're going to do that. Add the permissions, application, go to application permission, read write owned by, add permissions, and add also the role permission. Okay, don't forget to grant admin consent. I already added them previous, so they were already green with me, but if it's orange, you need to grant admin consent. If it's everything is granted, then it should be okay. Now we go back to Visual Studio Code. I remembered earlier that when I used this, and I have to check my terminal, if you run into, had made a connection before and you run into authentication issues, I really recommend to reset your PowerShell, because I had that earlier tonight. So just make sure if before you run this, you have a new PowerShell. Yeah, you can just create one new terminal and make sure you have a new PowerShell session. Now we're going to see if the connection is working, if we can get a token. So that's line 13 until 22. Okay, we have token. So first we continue. I have make a short, small explanation of what enterprise applications are, but I guess if you already understand this part of the channel, you probably already know. Enterprise application part is basically the APIs which web application and SaaS application use to connect to the Azure AD, and then if it's set up properly with proper permissions, they can use the groups and the admin from Azure AD for authentication to the application. Okay, but we're now going to create one via the Graph API script. So we have a token now. I'll first split my screen into 2 so we can see immediately the results in the portal of what we're doing. If you create an enterprise application or a service principal, if you call them, as they also are called, the first thing you need to do is you create an app registration. Normally, if you do this via the portal, you start with the enterprise application. If you do it scripted, you create an app registration first, and from the app registration, it will be generate an enterprise application. I've created these variables. It's called test application 1. And I added so an UPN of a user we're going to add. It will be the user of the application. We added an owner, we add a group. And we also add API permissions, scripted. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an app registration. That's pretty straightforward. It will take the display name from the variable we have configured and created via the Graph API for application and application. As always, it's just an invoke REST method with the UPI. It uses the token to access it and uses the body converted to a JSON file to create the app registration. Okay, so let's start to create an app registration via running code 34 until 39 and see what happens. Okay, so now we should see, if we click all applications, we should be able to see an app registration called test application 1. Let's give it a minute. Yep, there it is. So now we created the app registration. The second part of the script, it's what we're going to create an enterprise application. As mentioned in my previous videos, what I do here, the invoke REST method is basically sending the body with the token and the URL that's mentioned here. And that basically creates the application. I always put a variable in front of it, so it will pipe the results back to this variable. So if you look at this variable, you can see over here that all the values of the API are pushed back to the variable. In this case, this is pretty straightforward. For the app registration, we only register a display name, but you can also add a few other attributes that are mentioned here. So this is in the app registration in its most basic form. We want to create a service principal / enterprise application from this app registration, and therefore we need the app ID. So if you can see here, we create a variable called app, or in the JSON file there's an app ID, and we use this value, and this is basically the idea of the app registration we created. So this will fill in this value. You can test it if you want, so it's pretty easy. Just copy it. You can see the variable that's used here will be that number. See? Okay, so let's run this, and this will basically do the same, similar like the app registration, only it will create now the service principal, aka enterprise application. So let's run that and see what happens, and press line 43 until 48. Okay, now we go to enterprise application. Yeah, you need to remove the filter enterprise application, otherwise you probably won't see it. Just give it a minute. Yep, there it is. So we are also created a service principal from the app registration. Okay, now we're going to configure API permissions. I'm going to configure two API permissions. That's an application read all and a delegate read all. I will explain that later. I just want to show you, I've added in this script also a URL which you can find these codes that are mentioned here. Let me show it. There it is. That's this one. So if, for example, we are going to use this, read full user's profile. That's one from the delegation, and the application has a different code, and that's this one, read all users full profiles. That's the application. I will show you, when I've run the script, I will show you how it looks like in the portal, and that's much more it will explain it a bit better. So we're going to run and set now the API permissions. So that's done via this code. That's line 52 until 76. So we select that, press F8. And then also keep in mind it's a patch method instead of a post method. Patch method means it's a mutation instead of a new entry. Okay, so have a look what the result is of this. We go to app registration, look at the application we created, and then look at the API permissions. As you can see, we created an application and delegated. I can make the screen a bit bigger. Oh, that's not what I was intended. Go to API permissions. It's basically like this. If you add a permission manually and you look at the graph, you can do a delegated. It's also explained the delegated is your application needs to access the API as a signed user. So basically, it will use the user account to access the application. And that's mainly used with web applications, and application permission is used a bit differently like we do it. We use it to modify the Azure AD, and it's more basically like a service account instead of a user. So the application permission is, as you can see in the script, it has also a different code than the delegate permission. And let me demonstrate. If you look here, a role is an application permission and the scope is a delegate permission. That's what you need to remember. And you can also change these codes and then also grant it different access rights. And the annoying thing is you need to sort out the ID or this code, and you can't use a subscription. So it's a bit of you need to sort out which code you need. Okay. Let me check. If you want a tip, you can do this also by using a get of the application, and then you see the code. So if you want a specific code, you also can add it manually, do a get of the application and see which codes actually added to the API permission, so you can see which one you need. Okay. Interface a bit screwed. Of course, in real life you won't use it like this, but this is just for demonstration purposes. As you can see, both haven't got the admin consent. That's in the next part of the script. We're first going to do it for the delegation. What is important that if you grant admin consent, you need what they call the resource ID, and that's basically the object ID of the graph aggregation service. That's different for every tenant, and I will show you how you can find it. If you go to enterprise applications, you can type in not the graph aggregation service, which you need to look for, because in the old interface you can use this name, but it's now called Microsoft Graph. I will change the subscription in the or this. I will add the Microsoft Graph in this comment if I finalize the script. So we need that ID, and that's different for every tenant. So you type in Microsoft Graph, and you can recognize it if you have the right one by using the application ID starting with 8 zeros and a 3, and then this behind it. This is the code you need. So if you open it, and the funny thing is if you open it, it will get the old name back. It's a bit funny. Because in the old, if you look at the previous portal interface for enterprise application, it was called it, and now they changed the name to Microsoft Graph. But at least what we're looking for is the object ID, and in this case that's this, and I've added that as the resource ID, which is required to grant admin permission. It's required for the delegation permissions and for the application permissions. Only the syntax is a bit different, but we'll come into that later. So what we're going to now, in this part of the code, we grant the admin consent to the delegated permissions. And the scope is in this case the user read all. Okay, so we select it's line 80 until 91. Okay, now if we go back to the app registration, we look for our test application, you can see the API permissions, the delegated permissions should now have granted admin consent. Press a refresh, yep, and you can see it's now granted admin consent. And we've done that via script. Okay, so the next part is to grant admin consent via script to the application variant of the read all users full profile. So we're going to do that now. And that's this part of the code. It's a different code, but basically you need the same, also use a resource ID, and then the app permission is required. And that's basically, yeah, the one we also entered here. So you need to look up that code, and then you can use this code to grant admin consent to it. So let's try that. That's line 96 until 106. So press F8. Okay. Now the application permission should be granted admin consent. So see what happens. Yep, there it is. So we now granted admin consent via script. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is to set the owner of the application, and that's on the enterprise application part. It's a bit annoying if you want to look at your application you created, you need to remove the application type enterprise application. So you see them all, and press test and you see it over here. Okay, so now with this part of the code, we're going to set the owner. So the first thing it will do is we've added an owner UPN in the beginning of the script. It will retrieve via this command the ID, and then that will be added via this code as the owner of the application. It also will retrieve the app ID. Well, you can read the owner. Oh, by the way, that's interesting. I didn't mention it. It will set the owner to the application, to the enterprise application and the app registration in one go. You can split that, but that doesn't really make sense in real life because I think the enterprise application and app registration are a bit of a symbiote. You always use them together. So can't think of a real life example if you want to split that, but maybe with management that's an idea. But in real life I haven't seen it yet, but it's able to split it. But in this script I set the same owner to both the app registration and the service principal / enterprise application. So just run this and see what the results are. So press F5, sorry, F8, not F5, because that will run the whole script. Go to the owners. The Graph API connector is the owner because it's created it, but we wait a second. Yep, there's a Delvance we created in the area. So that's the owner on the enterprise application. If you go back into the top of the script, you can see we used a Delvance as the owner. Okay, so if you look, it's the owner of the enterprise application and it's the owner of the app registration also. Let's have a look. Can we see that? Yes, see it's also here. And of course, the Graph API connector is always the owner because it's created via the Graph API connector. That's behavior by design. Okay, now we're going to add members, and add members is basically the users that are allowed to use this application. Go back to the enterprise app because that's put on that level. Yeah, the script is pretty straightforward. What you're going to do is retrieve the user ID and then add it via this code to the users and groups over here. So in this case, we will use the user, which is called, that's the user Diego S, will be added to the users and groups for the test application. So let's run this code and see what it's working. Okay, that's line 128 until 140. Yep, and then it should be added. Here, it always takes a minute. There's no refresh button, is it? No. Okay, so. Yep, there it is. But of course, usually in real life, you want to add a group. So I've always added this script to add the group. 142 until 145, press F8. Yeah, it takes a minute. It's already there, but the portal is a bit slow as usual. Before it will show the mutation. Yep, there it is. So the marketing group is now also capable to use the test application. Okay, I hope you found this video and script useful. You can find the script, of course, on my blog in the links below. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments, and I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.